Okay, so in this lecture, I'm going to talk through some of the security issues that might encounter with internet scale applications. So there's many kinds of security threats to them, and commercial websites are particularly vulnerable. They're vulnerable because there's potential for political controversy, they've got lots of customer data, credit cards, and so on. And there's a little bit of a monoculture. I mean, there's maybe, maximum 10 server-side scripting languages, and if one of them has a vulnerability, then you can crack into, maybe a tenth of the websites. So, a little bit of a monoculture. But the security threats also apply to other kinds of internet scale application, such as online games, peer-to-peer systems, cryptocurrencies, and all this kind of stuff. So it's a general problem with any kind of application that runs across multiple computers and is accessed by millions of people every day. So the sorts of threats, I'm going to go through some of these, I'm going to go more through the mechanisms. So these are the sort of threats or things bad stuff that could happen, essentially. So we've got criminals stealing credit card information, bank details, personal identity, this kind of stuff. A lot of talk about governments snooping on personal data, allegedly with good intent. Then we've got foreign governments trying to sort of crack into systems in the UK to access information. We've got sabotaging, governments like the UK or Israel or America trying to crack into systems in Russia, North Korea, Iran, in order to sabotage their activities. Blocking of websites or game servers, or sort of direct action by different kinds of activists because they don't like what a website says or don't like what a government's doing, or this kind of thing. I'll go into some of these in a little bit more detail. So those are little examples of the sorts of bad stuff that could happen. Now let's just look in a little bit more detail about the kind of people who are actually trying to carry out these kinds of bad actions. So broadly speaking, break it down into criminals, governments, and people who are either activists, freedom fighters, or terrorists, largely depending on your point of view, right? I mean, if they might be, depending if you might be a freedom fighter according to yourself and your mates, but the government might think that you're just a terrorist. So criminals are, one of the main sort of agents online who are trying to break into different kinds of systems, access accounts, and so on and so forth. They might try and steal credit card details, bank details, so on. There's a lot of people cracking into people's machines in order to send spam, or there's an increase in ransomware where someone breaks into your computer, encrypts all your files, and charges you, let's say £1,000 to decrypt them. So if you haven't got a backup elsewhere, you might be willing to pay them because otherwise you lose all your data, which could cost you an awful lot more money. And there's a lot of talk about theft of intellectual property as well. People breaking into American companies, for example, to steal like intellectual property sort of plans for the next iPhone 20 or whatever it is, this kind of stuff. So governments, there's all these. Orwell in 1984 made all these dark predictions about governments spying on every person's lives, spying on all people's lives, and to some extent these dark predictions have come true with this complete, heaven knows how many security cameras we appear on, and there's also governments are very interested in snooping on the personal data of their citizens. Now, from the government's point of view, they say, well, hey, if you've got nothing to hide, then you might as well just let us see whatever we can see, and we'll just do our job, sort of stuff. We'll just install a security camera in your bedroom. If you've got nothing to hide, well, why should you care, right? It's always, serious professionals will be looking into your bedroom via this camera, so you don't have to worry about anything. So, personally, I'm a little bit skeptical about this government snooping business, and a lot of other people are as well. The governments also carry out sort of cyber warfare on enemy communications infrastructure. So a couple of examples, I'm not sure if I'm going to mention them later, but have I mentioned later? Yeah, so I've got some examples. And government's also somewhat notorious for stealing intellectual property from other companies, and also for hacking into computers as part of criminal investigations. So there was that brouhaha about cracking into someone's iPhone by the FBI and whether they could do it and whether Apple would help them and all this kind of stuff. So this is kind of stuff governments like to do, and they're going to use the same technologies as criminals, but just for good purposes, as they would claim. So, for example, Chinese government has a bad reputation for theft of intellectual property from American companies. There was this whole stuff. Can't remember his name now. The guy who's in the Bolivian embassy. for leaking all this stuff about the US government spying on US citizens and citizens of other countries, the national security agencies, something like that, you know, listening in on Angela Merkel's mobile calls, whatever it was. So there's all this big-scale snooping of government on US citizens, but more problematically on European citizens, citizens from other countries. So governments even go to the trouble of releasing malicious software to sabotage facilities in other countries. So there's this Stuxnet worm, which was, you know, thought to be built by America and Israel. I think it was distributed as a, it was infected, they distributed free USB drives at some conference and to Iranian nuclear scientists, and somehow this worm made its way into their facilities. I think, don't take that as gospel. And you know, a while ago, I think the Russians were stealing software from the Americans, and the Americans knew this, so they changed the software, and it caused a massive explosion in the Siberian gas pipeline. So there's all kind of dark stuff going on, and I don't doubt that the government is spending an awful lot of money working out how to crack into any old version of Windows you like, or any old version of Linux you like, or any version of iOS you like. So that's the government. Then we have the activists, freedom fighters, and terrorists. As I said, the name of these people depends on who you are, really. And so they carry out denial of service attacks because they're sort of righteous cause or whatever. They deface websites to raise political issues. And sort of fairly recent example of this is the Syrian Electronic Army. So they're supporting the current government as time of recording of Bashar al-Assad. And so they deface the websites of Syrian rebels, Western websites that support the rebels, use malware to locate the Syrian rebels, spam websites with pro-Bashar comments, and spy on technology and media companies. So this is the Syrian Electronic Army. Again, freedom fighters or terrorists, depending on where you stand in all that. So those are the players. Now, what kind of mechanisms are they using to access other people's computers and interfere with other people's internet scale applications? Well, these are the types of attack. We've got physical attacks, social engineering, network attacks, and compromise the computer in different ways. So I'm going to talk through all these in a little bit of detail. So this course is not really focused on the security issues or the privacy or legal issues, which can be covered next, but it's very important to be aware of them when working in this area. And there'll certainly be questions on them in the end-of-term quizzes, and there'll likely to be questions on them in the exam as well. So, you know, and I'm not expecting you to make your mini project 1 or mini project 2, you know, immune from interference from the American government. I'd be asking a bit much, but you should certainly be aware of these. And if you ever do implement commercial websites or, you know, online game or something like that, you need to be very aware of these different mechanisms and protect yourself as best you can against them. So this is a physical attack. So easy because all you need to do, because it's, you know, it doesn't require any really complex technical knowledge. All you have to do is walk into the company HQ with a fake ID. So you print out, take a picture of someone walking into the company, copy their ID, you know, using Photoshop or whatever, print one out. And because the ID is not going to get you into the company, you're going to have to tailgate a person through security. So people are notorious for holding doors open for other people. It's a sort of built-in politeness mechanism, right? So, you know, if the door has a security access mechanism on it, chances are someone's going to hold it open for you. So once you've got through security by tailgating person, you plug a small computer into the network or USB stick into the employee's computer, and this gives you access from the outside into the company's internal networks, which will be typically less secure. They'll be protected against the outside, but they won't be less protected against each other. So you can then go to the internet cafe next door, and, you know, maybe with a wireless connection or something, you can log into the company's internal network, and you can sniff passwords, or you can even put a keystroke logger on this employee's computer or whatever. So you can access the computer and intranet remotely. And it's riskiest because if I'm just sitting at home, you know, hacking into a computer in China or something, there's fairly low chance the Chinese government's going to actually get me, right? Whereas if I'm actually walking into company HQ with a fake ID and a security person apprehends me, then there's a very good chance of being caught. But it's easiest, as I said, because it doesn't require, you know, all you've got to do is be able to write a small server or something like that. It's not a super sophisticated mechanism for attack as opposed to running a buffer overflow, which I'll talk about later. So social engineering. So in this case, it's generally combined with phishing or something like that. So you do some research, you sort of do a search of the company employees, you find a sort of non-technical member of staff who's got fairly high level access, like a PA of a director or something like that. and then you sort of send them a phishing email, send them a fake email saying, oh, you know, we're upgrading your email system and we're going to give you a call soon. Then you give them a call and say that there's an issue with their account, or we're upgrading the email system, whatever. Could you please confirm your username and password, and I'll activate the new feature for you, or I'll transfer it for you, or whatever. And this works very well as well. It works well if you're a good sort of person, if you're a smooth talker, fast thinker, and good at sort of manipulating people and dealing with their anxieties and, making them bend to your will. If you're the kind of person who's good at manipulating other people, social engineering attack can work well. As I said, often combined with fake emails. And once you've got the username and password, then it's dead easy, just log into the system and job done. To protect against these kind of attacks, you need to educate your staff, right? You tell them never to give their username and password over the phone or by email. You need to educate security personnel so that, for example, they need to be able to look out for tailgating and stop people holding the door open for each other. Much better, though, is to engineer the physical access points. Instead of having a swipe card door entry like we've got at Middlesex, much better to have like a turnstile so that people can't let other people through. Engineer the physical entry to make this kind of stuff harder. And this kind of social engineering attack relies on being able to find the phone number of the PA of the director or something, and you can make it harder by minimizing information about the employee that is available outside the company. So don't make your intranet visible externally, for example. Okay, so next kind of attack I'm going to talk about is man-in-the-middle attack, where we sniff some data on the network and manipulate it in order to access a remote machine. So suppose we have Alice communicating with Bob, and then we have the nefarious Colin, who's listening to communications using network sniffing tools. And then what Colin does is he pretends to be Alice or Bob and continues to communicate with Alice or Bob, authenticates himself with Bob using the information he sniffed, and Bob could be a server or whatever. So here you have normal communication, and then what we have is a man-in-the-middle attack. So this is say Alice, this Bob, and here's the infamous Colin. So instead of the information flowing nicely between Alice and Bob, the attacker pretends to be the server, let's say, such that the user then logs in, thinking they're logging into the server, actually logs in via the attacker. So the attacker gets hold of the so if this was encrypted, say he somehow intercepts it and routes it through his own machine, he can then get hold of the username and password and then authenticate himself with the server, let's say. So strong encryption can help to some extent. It depends how it's used. And you can use web and email security systems to sort of sniff check for users that shouldn't be there, this kind of stuff. You can use certificate authority. So in some scenarios, the user here will use one public key we'll use a public key or something to talk to the server, and then they might use the same public key to talk to the attacker instead, but then this attacker can then use a different public key to talk to the server. And if we're validating, we're only allowing public keys that are special allowed public keys or certified public keys, then he won't be able to generate his own one and use it to talk to the server. And latency communications, obviously it's going to take longer for Alice to talk to Bob through Colin than it would take if she talked directly through the router. So by monitoring latency communications, you can detect whether people are carrying out this kind of attack. Now it comes to denial of service attack. Now this is, again, not super high tech, but it can be very effective. So it's so the idea of a denial of service is what it says. It's a denial of service, and it usually refers to stopping another computer from working. And you might have something against Amazon, for example, and you might want to try and stop Amazon stop the Amazon websites from working by crashing their servers or flooding the servers. That's the sort of aim of the denial of service attack. It denies service and costs someone money. That's the general idea. So it might cost someone money by putting a commercial website down, or it might prevent a news site from being up and therefore being accessible, which would also cost them money because of the loss of advertising, whatever. So crashing servers used to be easy. It's kind of hard now. But they used to be you used to be able to send a large ping packet that would just cause the server to fall over and die, or a teardrop attack where you could send mangled IP fragments. But most of these things have been fixed now, so I wouldn't hold your hopes up high for crashing a server with a single packet. You can protect against this with the latest operating system and patches. Never know, it may come back, but as far as I'm aware, it's largely been dealt with. This is much more common. So the idea is you want to stop a website from being operational, you want to stop anyone else from accessing the other website. And so what you do is you overload the server with requests so that legitimate customers can't get through. And a typical way of doing this is use what's called a botnet to generate a huge number of requests to the website, and that's what's called a distributed denial of service attack. And an even more sophisticated, slightly more complicated version is what's called a reflective denial of service attack. And I'll try to explain both very briefly. So with a botnet, it's like a large number of machines, maybe 10,000 machines, maybe even up to 100,000 machines that have been separately compromised by an attacker. So maybe the attackers used phishing emails to get access to these machines. And so the attacker will have some kind of little server or some kind of little program running on each of these machines so they can be controlled from a single computer. So the machines used to sort of log into an internet relay chat system. So they used to get their commands by logging into some chat room type thing. Or they could just have a little server sitting there with a certain port open, or even an HTTP port, whatever. They can make an HTTP request to this controller and get back their commands from their attacker. So these machines are all controlled by the attacker through some phishing attack or something like that. And a couple of the essay topics are going to be on DDoS, are going to be on botnets. So a couple of you at least will find out more about that and be able to explain that to us in the class presentations. So the attacker controls all these machines. And in the DDoS attack, he instructs all these machines to bombard the victim, i.e. web server, with like large numbers of packets. So large numbers of GET requests, for example. And because this is a fairly small server, or just a single server, let's say, if it gets constantly bombarded with tens of thousands of requests every second, it won't be able to serve requests from legitimate customers. So that's a straight up distributed denial of service attack. And then we have the reflected denial of service attack. In this case, we're sending a packet to another machine. That's why it's called reflected. It's a neutral third-party machine, but I'm sending a packet with a fake IP address. So I'm pretending, so suppose we're trying to attack 135.456.20.222.44, right? So I send a fake IP packet that claims to be from this address to another computer. And the other computer replies to this address, so I'm reflecting, so I'm sending a request to that other computer. That other computer sending back a reply to the target machine. And if I'm clever, I can send a very small request to another computer or lots of other computers, and they can all send very big packets back to the target machine. So that's called amplification. And I can even use that with a botnet. So my entire botnet can send off a request to somewhere, and all the responses will go back to the target machine and overload its bandwidth. That's the idea. This is what the amplification is. You use a small query, it generates a large answer. So you used to be able to do this, I don't know if you still can, on the DNS system. So here we have the attacker, here we have the botnet, and so you have like a IP lookup request. So you send that to the DNS servers, and they do all the kind of recursive query stuff, and then reply with the IP address. And let's suppose that this is a small packet we're sending out here, because you could just send all the packets directly to here. But by using in this way, if we send a small packet out here, we're not using up too much of our bandwidth here, and then we're getting a big response here from high bandwidth servers, and then that can potentially completely overload. Yeah, so each packet reply can be amplified by a factor of 70, according to where this diagram came from. So we're getting a big amplification factor by going via the DNS system, and that's what a reflective DDoS attack is. So all these machines are pretending to be this machine when they're sending off the DNS requests. So there have been various examples of this. So Spam House, I think it's an anti-spam website, was targeted by distributed denial service from, I think, spam people who wanted to do spam. Amazon didn't like, Anonymous, it's like a hacking cooperative, something like that, didn't like the fact that Amazon stopped hosting WikiLeaks because it's too controversial, so they tried to carry out a DDoS attack on Amazon. Amazon's huge, so it had little effect. And UK government's accused of using DDoS attacks against hacking groups in Syrian Electronic Army. How can you protect? Well, it's a tricky one because you have the entire machines across the internet, bombarding your own little humble server with lots and lots of packets. It's like an internet scale problem. You can't shut down the botnet by yourself unless you're very, very clever. So you just got this problem of huge numbers of packets coming into your machine. The only way you can really deal with this is web caching on a large scale. So if your website is hosted on a Kami, then their 175,000 servers are probably going to be resistant to attacks from a 10,000 machine botnet. So you've got Cloudflare, another caching company, or Kami. And a firewall, you could block all the packets, but then the firewall itself as a computer program is likely to get overloaded. Even if it's a hardware one, it'll fall over and die at some point. Okay, so that's these DDoS attacks. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about different ways of breaking into a computer. So we've got the kind of buffer overflow attack, SQL injection, phishing, and backdoor. Well, backdoor is not really well, it sort of is a way of breaking in, actually. Okay. So buffer overflow attack. So this is, again, it used to be a big thing a while ago, and I bet there's still a few buffer overflow attacks out there, but it's less common than it was. So buffer overflow attacks rely primarily on some old C libraries, at least they used to. I don't know what, there probably are other ones, more subtle ones. It's all a very specialized area, but one classic kind of buffer overflow attack was this C library, and the C library kind of, I think, copied a string, something like that. So it copied data into memory. And when it reached a certain predefined character, then that was the sign that it should stop copying the string. I think it was a string function, string library. So it would copy the string into memory, and when it reached the end of string character, I think it was like a null or something like that, a slash, like a 0 or something, then the copying process would stop. But by feeding it a sort of malformed string, then this copying process would never stop, and it would keep copying things into memory, indefinitely. So you could use this. So if you fed in your string from like through a website or through some kind of service that the computer is running, then the C library copied it into memory, then you could potentially copy an entire program into memory by not including the end of string character. That's the idea. So this dodgy library would essentially write your program into memory such that it would be executed by the computer, and all you'd have to do is send a string to that computer in order to execute your program on that computer. So there's this SQL slammer worm, use a buffer overflow vulnerability to infect 75,000 machines in 10 minutes. So when it works brilliantly. That's the idea. So you have like so what it's doing is the string libraries, instead of just writing a limited amount of things into memory, it writes something much longer into memory, includes the malicious code, and it also includes like a little jump command that instructs the computer to jump to the start of the malicious code and begin executing it. So I'm not going to go into each detail, but there's something to be aware of. That says less serious than it was, likely to resurface. You need to keep your operating system up to date with kind of patches, etc. You can minimize the number of services that are visible to the internet. And you can also get hardened operating systems that are much more rigorously tested for overflow vulnerabilities and stuff. Antivirus might help a little bit, but not necessarily. Now this is a problem that's much more likely to affect you, particularly if you end up doing web development. It's called an SQL Injection Attack. And it's all due to a failure of validation, essentially. So the attacker enters some SQL in a web browser. Maybe they're entering a form to like register in your site or something. But by cleverly including SQL in the information that they submit, they can execute arbitrary SQL on your server unless you check it very carefully. So you can access malicious SQL, which can give full access of the attacker to the database. It's a classic way of stealing data and defacing websites. It's quite easy to do, and it's quite a good way to change the database and to download the database if you want to download it, and do anything you like with the database. It doesn't give you access to the machine necessarily, but it does give you access to the database. And this is how it works roughly. So let's suppose we talked in the talk on commercial websites, discussed all these kind of server-side scripts that receive GET requests or POST requests or whatever from the user, and then execute and then interact with the database to retrieve data that's then formatted in HTML and sent back to the user. So let's suppose we're reading username from the user. The user's logging in, they enter their username and maybe a password as well. And in the SQL, in the PHP, we've got this statement, select all from users where name equals username, right? And what they can do, so that's the PHP. And then what the attacker can do, instead of entering their username, they can enter or 1 equals 1. So in this case, this statement will become select all from users where name equals close quotation marks or 1 equals 1. So it'll basically select all of the user data, and then what the user will see instead of, with a bit of luck, depending on how the PHP generates the HTML, what the attacker will end up with is a complete list of all the data of all the users in that particular database. So they're entering SQL statements into the form. There's no validation of that SQL, of the form data, and therefore the SQL gets executed in the database. They can execute multiple statements. So suppose that this is the PHP. We've got select all from users where name equals username, same thing. And what the attacker types is drop table users, select all from user info where t equals t, whatever. So they can basically change, instead of entering their username, they enter SQL. The SQL gets executed, and they can delete the entire database or do whatever they like. So this is quite a serious form of attack, and if you're running any kind of commercial website, you're very vulnerable to this kind of attack. So you need to validate your user input extremely carefully. So you need to use, on the client side, you need to use JavaScript. Don't allow the form to be submitted until it's been carefully validated for SQL statements. There'll be JavaScript libraries and stuff out there for that. And then you can check on the server side as well, using PHP or Java. Make sure that the input's not malicious. There'll be like a regular expression you can check your input with to make sure it doesn't have like select or update or delete or any of these kind of statements. So it's easy to protect against, but you've got to be aware of this kind of attack so that you can protect against it. Then we have phishing attacks. I sort of mentioned this briefly before. The idea is you send the fake email. It's either got a malicious attachment, classic, slightly overworn strategy, or more subtly, if you could follow certain links on browsers, the browsers themselves have vulnerabilities in them, and you can use that to install malicious code on the user's computer. So that you've all had these kind of emails, right? You're eligible for a tax refund. Someone's dodgy's getting into your account, log in here to confirm it. Or here's your invoice, for something you haven't bought, so you click to see that it's actually existed. Some of them are very clever. Some of them have got extremely bad spelling and grammar, so they're kind of obvious that they're bad. The links almost always give them away. If you look carefully at the link, it'll be like google.doggywebsite.org or something. So you see the Google and you might think it's okay, but then the .doggywebsite.org or something suggests that it's not okay, or it'll be hidden in some complex link. So you look at the links if you're a little bit ambiguous about it, but you should never give your password online anyway, or follow any of these kind of links. If you think it might be real, then log in separately on the RBS Bank site instead of clicking on the link, because that link is going to lead you to a fake website where you give your user information to the fake website instead of to the real one. So 100 million customer records stolen from Home Depot. Carbonate gang stole 1 billion from 100 institutions, all using phishing attacks. It works. Educate your staff. Tell them never to click on links or enter their emails, whatever. You can scan your emails with antivirus, anti-spyware. Blacklist dodgy websites. Use a secure browser. Update regularly. These kind of mechanisms you can protect. And then we have backdoors. So the idea with a backdoor is that someone who's working on Linux, OS X, or Windows modifies the operating system, or maybe they modify MySQL database, which will run services on user machines. So some bit of code on the user's machine has been modified so that an attacker could gain access to that machine in some subtle and malicious way. So a nice example of this was the attempt that was made to add a subtle backdoor to the Linux kernel. Very subtle code, but would enable someone just with a few, carefully configured, pings or whatever it was, to gain access to any machine that was running this version of the kernel. So that's the case of the Linux kernel, open source. So someone picked it up. Who knows, what mechanisms Windows has for monitoring who's changing what code. I'll bet you money that the government, has ways of using backdoors of get into things like Linux, probably, maybe Windows, maybe OS X. It's something they're very keen on. It wouldn't be at all surprising if they were trying to find ways of adding backdoors to software in different ways. Once you've got a backdoor, you've got a way of accessing the machine, and then you can install more malicious software, such that software that makes the machine part of a botnet, and other software, other kinds of buffer overflows or whatever can also be used to install malicious software on your machine. Sometimes referred to as a rootkit. So rootkit's a bit of software that manipulates the operating system. So normally when you go down to a particular folder, you see what's in the contents of that folder, right? But with a rootkit, it might pretend that might make the operating system lie about its existence. So it wouldn't show up in the process manager or whatever in Windows. When you tried to look at the folder where the rootkit was installed, it would show you just an empty folder. So it completely hides itself in the operating system. So from the user's perspective, you can't see that it's there. And that's what's called a rootkit. There was a notorious rootkit with Sony tried to install rootkit as part of its digital rights management system for one CD, I think, and it was much, got a lot of flack for doing so. So it's rootkit's a piece of code, program that's subtly hidden in the operating system and changes the operating system's view of the file system, so that it misreports file sizes, gives incorrect lists of open ports, doesn't list the processes that are running, and so on. So it's obviously very hard to detect and remove. Rootkits can also record your keystrokes, send them back to a controller system, so they can see what you're doing to log into your bank, and then send that back to the Carbonate gang, for example. They can extract data. They can make you part of a zombie. They can store illegal files, dodgy terrorist manuals, illegal pornography, this kind of stuff. Anti-spyware might pick it up, but because it's manipulating the operating system, it can be more difficult to find with this kind of thing. There's special software can be used for rootkits, and the software will do sort of checksums of your operating system files to see if they've been manipulated, or whether you're misreporting file size, folder sizes, etc. So I've mentioned botnets already. I'll just say a little bit more about them. So, as explained, this sort of revisits the material covered already, but a botnet is essentially a large number of systems that are controlled using a rootkit, something like that. And the attacker can then instruct these large numbers of machines, maybe 100,000, whatever, some of the bigger ones, and they can use that to send lots of spam, maybe Bitcoin mining on some of them, and they can also use for distributed denial of service attacks. So firewalls can be part of this security protection. They can block ports, so if your attacker is using port 56 or whatever to run a service that makes it part of a botnet, then you can block access to port 56. You can protect vulnerable services, so if you're running a database, you can make it invisible to the outside world. As I said, you can prevent malware from communicating online, but they've got their own vulnerabilities, and it's probably quite easy for malware to pretend to be a browser, for example, just make an HTTP request through port 80 or 8080, whatever, and so can hide its activities without needing access to specific ports. There are intrusion detection systems. They sniff network traffic, raise alerts when they see a malicious packet. The problem with these is they generate a large number of false alarms. So when I worked on this project Safeguard, we were trying to build a system to protect internet scale applications against attacks, failures, and accidents. But we're working with Swisscom, and Swisscom, we're using Snort. But this thing generates enormous numbers of false alarms. Anything, if someone did a search for like worms for gardening or something like that, maybe it would generate an alert. So you've got vast numbers of false alarms, which made it pretty much useless because, to try and sift through all these kinds of alarms took an awful lot of time. And these kind of intrusion detection systems have problems if they're working with encrypted traffic, which a lot of traffic is now, because they can't see inside it, so they can't detect signatures of worms. But they might be useful in some cases. Another good way to increase your security is carry out penetration testing. So you can get hold of some of the hacking tools and see if you can use those hacking tools to break into your system. If you're a big company, you're going to hire a specialist to do this for you, someone who knows how to break into systems. They'll attempt to break into your system, and they'll tell you what vulnerabilities you have. And all this penetration testing can be part of a full security audit. So security audit will do this penetration testing, vulnerability scans, the software that does all that, no doubt expensive software does all that. And a security professional will look at the access controls, the physical access, what operating systems you're running, what applications are running, what their vulnerabilities. So physical access, how the routers are configured for man-in-the-middle attacks, so on. Look at the firewalls, and also look at what happens if someone does steal all your customers' data. What are procedures do you have in place in order to get that data back? Is it backed up securely? Is it backed up in a way that's different from the way in which it was originally stored? Otherwise, the attacker could compromise both and potentially delete both. Security issues are very relevant to the Internet of Things as well. So there's a lot more things being connected to the Internet. We've got cars, thermostats, washing machines, baby alarms, televisions, and so on. And so with just a computer, they're going to access data. It's going to be damaging. It's going to be bad, but there's no physical damage. Whereas if they can break into your car systems, they can maybe cause you to shut down at high speed. You could lose the brakes. You could do all kinds of different things once you could access real physical things over the internet. So a whole world of new problems. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail in the last lecture in this course, I think it is. Now, cloud storage and data processing, there's this sort of uneasy balance between your responsibility for the security of your data and the cloud provider's responsibility for the security of your data. And that depends on what you're actually doing with the data. So if you're using software services of the cloud provider and all of the data is sort of being stored using their software services, so like S3, for example, is like a data storage web service, effectively, then most of the responsibility for securing the system is down to Amazon. On the other hand, if you're hiring a virtual machine from Amazon, with a sort of little mini operating system on it, all the rest of it, then to some extent your responsibility for the security of that system, if someone breaks into that virtual machine and uses it for something else, then that's your problem, not Amazon's problem. So, the sort of the more high level and abstract and software oriented your use of the cloud services, the less control you have over the security, right? And you have very little control of things like physical security. If someone walks into a data center and takes your data, then you've got no control over physical security anyway, right? Whereas if someone gets your S3 login credentials and uses that to access your data, then that's your problem. But if they run a buffer overflow attack against S3 and it works, then that's Amazon's problem. So it's this sort of weird, uneasy mix. And as I'll talk about in the lecture on legal issues, that can lead to some difficult and delicate balance with the legal stuff as well. When you're using the cloud to store data, you can help yourself a little bit by using encryption. So you can securely store passwords in encrypted files. Encryption also reduces the potential for man-in-the-middle attacks and makes it harder to sniff data from networks. But encryption can enable attackers to hide as well, right? It can make it harder to detect attacks and intruders. You can't use intrusion detection systems. It's hard to know it's just a bunch of like noise, really. You can't tell what's going on in your network. I don't know if I've got stuff on passwords. Yeah, I've got some on passwords, okay. Okay, so you can add security to cloud computing. Since in a way a lot of the security is out of your hands, it's better if you can reduce your vulnerability by encrypting your data. So you can encrypt the data that's stored in the cloud. So if someone does walk into the Amazon data center and steals a load of data, then it's encrypted so they can't make use of it. Obviously, you can encrypt communications between the client and the cloud. Otherwise, a man in the middle could just sniff it out of the network. And you can also encrypt the data on the clients so that if someone steals someone's computer but doesn't have the login details, then all the customer's data that's locally stored would be protected. And you need to sensibly store the keys because encryption's all very well, but if the passwords are written on the computer, then it's not terribly useful, right? So you need to select strong passwords. You don't write it down, store it electronically. Make sure the password you use doesn't have key. Yeah, you need to make sure passwords all very well, but if you've got a keylogger or a rootkit installed on your computer, then that can just read the password as you type it. So you need to be very sure that the computers that you use to access the cloud are themselves secure. And the credentials files, which I'll talk about in another lecture, you need to take great care of. Otherwise, someone who can access your credentials files can use Amazon Web Services, with your account. So passwords, one way in which password security is managed is you never store the plain text version of the password in the database. What you do is the customer enters the password, you encrypt the password and store it in the database. And at a later point, they enter the same password, you encrypt it using the same key, and then you compare the encrypted version of the password with the stored version of the password. In that way, if someone steals the database, they only have the access to the encrypted versions of the passwords, not to the plain text version. That's the theory. The problem is with like CUDA or graphics card acceleration, with distributed data processing, and so on, it's much easier now to crack passwords that are stored in this way, or you just need a brute force attack where you work away through every possible 8-character string, encrypt it with the key, and see if it matches the thing what's stored in the database. So you should certainly use this method of security for customer passwords. But if someone does steal the password file or the database containing the passwords, it can still be cracked quite quickly. You can also use permissions to limit the damage that's done. So if someone gains access, if you use permissions well, with a sort of series of permissions, with sort of people only have permission to do what they need to do and no more, then if someone steals someone with a low level of permissions, the account of someone with low-level permissions, then they can't do enormous amounts of damage. Maybe they can just destroy the user data of that particular person. They can't delete everything or steal everything. So you set policies that allow different types of data to be accessed by different people. So the customers, access their own data, and administrators can access everything. And you limit the access of employees on a need-to-access basis. No security method is perfect. Someone might tell you that X, Y, and Z, this magic software, this magic firewall, whatever, will work perfectly. That's never the case. You've always got to think in terms of layers and make each layer as secure as you possibly can, so that if the attacker breaks through one layer, then they've got to break through another layer with a different set of technology and a different set of technology. Make it hard at every possible layer, and you'll have some kind of viable security. The only unbreakable method is probably to not connect the computer to the internet, which obviously not going to work for an internet scale application. And even then, you've still got to think about physical security. So secure in depth. Even if you don't connect your computer to the internet, you've then got to think about physical security, and then you've got to think of passwords, and then you've got to think of encrypted data on the drive. Even that's not totally secure. There is no perfect security. You've got to secure in depth. So there's a couple of chapters on this in the course reading, in the books, student client, yep. I want to take a look at. So this lecture has covered security issues applying to internet scale applications. And then next lecture I'm going to talk about the privacy issues that apply to internet scale applications.